All right, this is the regulation section of our technical certificate course for UAV, and this is getting to the end of the course, preparing ourselves to take the Part 107 FAA written exam. So we'll continue to discuss regulations today. Just a reminder that the specific intent of the written exam from the FAA is to test your for a thorough knowledge of all the regulations pertaining to small UAS regulations and operations. So we're just going to review these hopefully briefly. I also want to remind you that if you go to the FAA.gov and search for the Remote Pilot Small Unmanned Aircraft System Study Guide, the FAA has published a document with pretty much all the same information. So pick that up and read through it. Most of us are dual kind of learners where it's helpful to have somebody explain it to us verbally, but it's also helpful to read through the information. So I would urge you to do both. And when you come up to something like, well, everything's been covered in the previous courses here at Southern Crescent Technical College, but if there is something you're still puzzled about or don't understand, hey, give me a ring, call. You've got my office hours. Make an appointment, come on by. We can talk about it, or email, text. Anyway, this is just a review here. So Part 107, it's CFR 14 CFR Part 107. You see at the top it says 14 CFR Part 107. The way that the regulations work is they have a decimal point for the paragraph. So it's paragraph 3, definitions. Let's just run through the definitions because there will be questions on the definitions of the various definitions. Control station just simply means the interface used by the remote pilot to control the flight path of the drone. Pretty simple. Corrective lenses simply mean spectacles or contact lenses. Declaration of compliance means a record submitted to the FAA that certifies unmanned aircraft that conforms to Category 2 or Category 3 requirements for flying over people. Okay, small unmanned aircraft is simply defined by an aircraft weighing less than 55 pounds on takeoff, including everything that's on board or otherwise attached to the aircraft. So if you attach something extra to it and it weighs more than 55 pounds, it's no longer a small. You're obtaining a license to fly small UAVs for compensation or hire. Small unmanned aircraft systems includes all of that, including the control station, the control link, all of those things that are involved. Okay, unmanned aircraft simply is defined as an aircraft operated without the possibility of direct human intervention from within or on the aircraft. So, of course, if we're going to have unmanned aircraft as a taxi service, the passengers will have to be prohibited from grabbing the controls or being within reach of actually controlling, or becomes an airplane then, a manned aircraft. Visual observer is that person who is designated by the remote pilot in command to assist him or her in keeping the aircraft in sight and seeing and avoiding other traffic or other objects or obstacles. Part 107.5 is falsification, reproduction, or alteration. That's basically fraud or intentional false record or report that's required to be made. Is prohibited. The commission of that by any person by one of those acts is the basis for denial of an application for remote pilot certificate or certificate of waiver, a denial of a declaration of compliance, or suspension, revocation of any certificate, waiver, or declaration of compliance. So, you know, if you're, I don't need to elaborate that. I don't think I need to elaborate on that. 107 points, paragraph 7, inspection, testing, and demonstration of compliance. This is basically allowing the administrator, the FAA administrator of the FAA, or his designated representative to ask for your registration certificate or your pilot's license at any time. But also this includes local law enforcement as well, or even the representative of the Transportation Security Agency. Upon demand, you have to produce identification who you are, typically a photo ID, or your remote pilot certificate with the UAS rating when exercising the privileges of a remote pilot certificate. In other words, if you're doing something for hire, and any other document, record, or report required to be kept. Also, the administrator, must allow the administrator to make any test or inspection of the aircraft, the control unit, the person, the PIC, or whoever's manipulating the flight controls, and observers. So they have the right to ask that. If you are as an employee of another company, which that's what we all would love to be able to be hired by a company to fly our drones, you're responsible for having the registration and all the documents. That's your responsibility. It's not your employer's responsibility. Your employer will say, go fly, and that's all they care about. They're not going to make sure you have all your documents with you. That's up to you. All right, accident reporting, 107, paragraph 9. I'm going to read the regulation right here, and I've explained to you how to get to the regulations. It's just type in 14 CFR part 107 and have some private organizations, but you of course want to go to the government site. Anyway, accident reporting, you no later than 10 calendar days after an operation that meets the criteria of either paragraph A or B, which I'll read to you in a second, of this section, remote pilot man must report to the FAA in a manner acceptable to the administrator any operation of the smaller unmanned aircraft involving at least A, would be serious injury to any person or loss of consciousness, B, damage to any property other than the small unmanned aircraft, unless one of the following conditions is satisfied. If the cost for repair does not exceed $500, you don't have to report. If the fair market value of the property does not exceed $500 in the event of total loss. Okay, so that's just word for word what the regulation states. So it's not that difficult to understand. $500, serious injury, loss of consciousness. Serious injury can be defined as stitches, hospital stay, that kind of thing. And we've talked about that before. All right. Paragraph 11, requirement for a remote pilot certificate, basically reads that for compensation or hire, no person may manipulate the flight controls of a small unmanned aircraft unless they have the remote pilot certificate with a small UAS rating. However, if a person, we would call that a person manipulating controls under the direct supervision of a remote pilot in command with the UAS rating, and that pilot in command has the ability to immediately take direct control of the flight, that would be permissible as well. Registration, no person operating a civil small unmanned aircraft system for the purpose of flight must comply with provisions from Part 91. Basically, that means that if it's more than 0.55 pounds, it must be registered with the government. And that's just a simple thing. You go to the website and basically fill in your information and pay $5. It's a pretty simple process, but you must comply. It must be registered if it's over 0.55 pounds. All right. Condition for safe operation. That's obviously the pilot command is responsible for not placing the drone in a situation where it might cause a hazard to people or property on the ground. Also, this is paragraph 15. No person may operate the small unmanned aircraft unless it is in condition for safe operation. Prior to each flight, the remote pilot in command must check the small UAS to determine whether it's in a condition for safe operation, and if at some time during the flight or the operation he or she becomes aware that there is a problem with the drone, then and he needs to make a decision about whether or not it's no longer in a condition for a safe operation, he needs to terminate the operation, pretty obviously. Then 17 is medical condition. No person may manipulate the flight controls of a small unmanned aircraft or act as a remote pilot command, visual observer, or a direct participant. Any direct participant if he or she knows or has reason to know that they have a physical or mental condition that would interfere with a safe operation, right? We don't do inspections, mental inspections before every flight, but however, they need to be able to state that. And I would assume that this applies to the pilot command being even responsible for those issues as well. If you know of your visual observer has a physical or mental condition that would interfere with the safe operation, that you wouldn't be giving him or her the right to manually control the aircraft, so that you're responsible as well. Remote PIC must be designated before the flight. And what we're saying here is that if there's 2 certified remote pilots and 1 drone, you both have to agree who is in charge at any particular moment. You can't both be trying to be in charge of the aircraft at the same time. It just gets confusing. Not to mention the division of labor, which makes it important that somebody is responsible. Additionally, the regulations is also saying that the remote pilot is directly responsible and also the final authority to the operation of the unmanned aircraft system. The remote PIC is directly responsible for the aircraft so that it will not pose undue hazard to other people, other aircraft, other property in the event of a loss of control of the small unmanned aircraft. So there has to be a plan to prevent harm to people or property or other aircraft in case of a loss of control. The remote pilot in command also must ensure that the aircraft operation complies with all regulations of this chapter. And the remote PIC must have the ability to direct the aircraft to ensure compliance with the applicable provisions of the chapter. So, in other words, if it was a autonomous flight, like mapping, and you're sending off to do its thing, where you don't have to constantly control it, it's doing its own thing, you must have an ability to stop that operation at any time and alter the course or lower it down, whatever, to prevent interfering with air traffic or possibly causing a hazard to people on the ground or property. In-flight emergency, that's part 21, or paragraph 21. In-flight emergency requires immediate action. In an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the remote pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent necessary to meet that emergency. All right. So now an example would be 400 feet. If you're flying at 400 feet and there's another drone at the exact same altitude, and in order to avoid crashing into each other, one of you, what were you supposed to do? Both to turn to the right. Let's say the other drone is not responding. You may want to climb above 400 feet. Well, that's illegal, right? What happens? Well, they're just saying you have the right to do that in order to prevent an accident. It's an emergency. Or if for some reason I can't imagine the need to go faster than 100 miles an hour, but if in order to avoid injury or damage to property on the ground you need to go over 100 miles an hour, that would be permissible, but only, again, to the extent necessary to meet that emergency. Just because there was a bird at 400 feet and you thought you might bump into the bird, oh, I'm going to climb to 500 feet. That doesn't mean for the rest of the day you can fly at 500 feet. That just means only until you can avoid hitting this endangered bird or something like that. All right. Also, this is probably more important and more relevant to the exam, the written exam, is remote pilot who deviates from the rule, from any rule in this particular situation in the sense of an emergency, must, upon request of the administrator, send a written report of that deviation to the administrator. Upon request. So in a deviation, it's not like an accident. It's like you've deviated to prevent an accident. They don't want to hear about it every time that happens. They have to ask you for it. Great. All right. Hazardous operation, that's part 23. No person may operate a UAV in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger the life or property of another, and additionally may not allow an object to be dropped from a small unmanned aircraft in a manner that creates undue hazard to person or property. That's paragraph 23. Pretty self-explanatory. Operation from a moving vehicle or aircraft. No person may operate from a small UAV from a moving aircraft. Or no person may operate a small UAS from a moving land or waterborne vehicle unless the small unmanned aircraft is flown over a sparsely populated area and is not transporting another person's property for compensation or hire. So for hire, you basically can't fly from a moving land or waterborne vehicle, basically restricting it to recreational use. Of course, that rule is going to have to change, right? That's one of those rules going to have to change if we're going to remember the FAA is in charge of safety, A, but B, also promoting the air commerce. And air commerce includes drones. The ability for drones to go out and deliver packages. This is a big issue that needs to be resolved. These major package delivery companies are working hard to get the FAA, and the FAA is willing to do it, but they want to be safe. They've got to be safe because they'll get blamed if somebody gets hurt. So they're working hard to change that rule to allow deliveries from vehicles. And also, this regulation is somewhat vague because it says sparsely populated area. They're giving some leeway for people to interpret that regulation. Alcohol or drugs. Person manipulating the flight controls of a small unmanned aircraft or acting as a remote pilot in command or visual observer. So any crew member must comply with Part 9117, which basically says and to go to those connections, if you're on the internet, it's hyperlinked, but you would do a 14 CFR Part 9117 to find the information about alcohol and drugs. So this is a blanket statement about all pilots and, well, all aviation. No person may act or attempt to act as a crew member of a civil aircraft, and that's what we are. Drones are civil aircraft. Within 8 hours after the consumption of an alcohol beverage, or while under influence of alcohol, or while using any drug which affects the person's faculties in any way contrary to safety, or while having an alcohol concentration of 0.04 or greater in blood or breath specimen. And there's more to it, but that's all we need to know. But those are just have to memorize those numbers. All right, paragraph 29 is still in the regulations. Operation at night, that's evolving, and there's some operations where you may operate after twilight, but the question probably will be still on the test about civil twilight, and that's what you got to remember. Civil twilight is 30 minutes before the sun goes up in the morning, and 30 minutes after the sun goes down at night. You're experientially aware of that, right? You've driven down the highway at that period after the sun has actually officially gone down and you see people driving down the highway with their lights off, it's because they visually look out the window, out the windshield of their car, and it looks bright enough, but it's not. It's officially sunset. But you have a 30-minute period where it's somewhat sunny or somewhat of light out there, but it's not dark. Anyway, during twilight, you got to have anti-collision lights visible for 3 miles. And that you may be permitted to dim those lights if you judge it in the interest of safety to dim those lights. And the only reason why you might do that I can think of is if when you're operating close to your to the operator, the flashing light could interfere with their night vision. Excuse me. Visual line of sight operations. That's part 31, or part 107, paragraph 31. Okay, with vision, that simply means you have to see your drone with vision unaided by any device other than a pair of glasses or contact lenses. Also, the visual observer must only principally use their eyeballs only. You may pick up the binoculars or some other device to see better momentarily to check the area for other air traffic, but primarily it's got to be visual sight with your eyeballs. Keep it in sight. And keeping in sight means you know where it is, you know what its altitude is, roughly attitude, and which way it's moving. You need to observe the airspace around the drone for other air traffic or other hazards, like wires or towers, and make sure that during the whole operation that the unmanned aircraft doesn't endanger the life or property of others. That's the pilot command, the person manipulating controls, and the visual observers have to do all of this. Have to be able to do this the whole time. Now, we'll talk about visual observer in just a second. Here it is right there, 33. Talks about the visual observer. So the scenario that I think the FAA is considering here is you're flying the drone perhaps more than 3 miles, or at least to a place where the person manipulating control can no longer see it. The visual observer is positioned in a place that he or she can see it at that period of time when the person manipulating controls or the pilot command can't see it. Well, there has to be a way to communicate back and forth, basically, is what they're saying. They don't state what kind of way of communication. Cell phones work great. Walkie-talkies, Morse code, maybe. Signal flags, I don't know. Some way there must be to communicate to the person that's actually controlling the drone about the hazards that might encounter. Like another aircraft shows up, I need to be able to tell the person manipulating controls, you need to get down, you need to lower, whatever, get out of the way. Or if there's a hazard, there needs to be some way of warning them. I don't belabor the point there, but there has to be there has to be somebody keeping it in sight constantly. You can't, okay, here we got 15 minutes, which it's going to be out of sight. Nobody can see it, but we know where it's going. No, you have to keep it in sight. This rule would change too, right? Because how are you going to deliver packages if somebody's got to see the whole thing the whole time? Well, just make the person carry the package. So that's going to change as well. So this is a rule that will change. But for now, and on the test, you got to keep it in sight. The visual observer has to have some way to communicate with the person manipulating the controls at all times, and somebody must be seeing it. Only one at a time, which brings me to the point, how are we going to do that and make money? We're going to have to change. This rule is going to have to change, probably. Probably in the interest of you and for you students that this doesn't change, because then they have to hire a drone pilot for every UAS that's delivering packages throughout the United States. Wow, we have to hire a lot of people, but the FAA is not going to go for that. Also, this reminds me that many of these regulations do qualify for waivers. The FAA has a list online of, well, there's a list in the regulations too, of regulations that can be waived. And a waiver basically is you go to the FAA, you decide you want to have more than two, let's just use this example, want to use more than two UASs at the same time before they change regulation. At this time, you'd have to fill out some paperwork and say, I can do this safely, and here's how I can do this safely. I can fly two UASs because I can keep them both at the same time. I have a way for them both to come home if they lose connection. You have to pretty elaborate explanation of what you're going to do to keep it safe. So you send that information to the FAA asking for a waiver. They send it to their committees. Their committees say, okay, I agree, you can do this safely. However, we want you to also have one drone have a red light flashing and the other drone have a blue light flashing, so you can tell the difference between the two, or something like that. They'll come up with something extra that you have to do. That goes into the paperwork. Then you get approval. Then you have to, during your operation with more than one UAS, you have to comply with all those rules. They also want to have 90 days in order to get out this whole thing done before they will promise that they'll might be not promise, but they will get back to you and give you an approval or disapproval. So 90 days is the typical time period where it takes them to work through the process of a waiver. So right now the basic rule is one at a time, but you can waive that. You can get a waiver for it. Hazmat, we're not allowed to carry any hazardous material on a drone, period. Strapping an extra battery to your drone, that's hazardous material. You can only use the battery or power source that's actually part of the drone. Can't strap an extra battery. You can't carry, as a payload, you can't deliver cans of gasoline with a drone. It's hazmat, etc., etc. Operation near other aircraft, right-of-way rules. Okay, this to review again. Each small unmanned aircraft must yield the right-of-way to all aircraft, all airborne vehicles, all launch vehicles, all re-entry vehicles. And as a further definition, yielding the right-of-way means that the small UAS must give way to other aircraft or vehicle and may not pass over, under, or ahead of another manned vehicle unless well clear. So, of course, one of the questions that we came about was you're flying around and there's a balloon in your area, and then one of the three choices is, well, fly above it. Nope, it's, that's not a good answer. And other half of that regulation, point 37, says no person may operate a small unmanned aircraft so close to another aircraft as to create a collision hazard. Again, very vague. And really, honestly, it goes back to what I've been saying all along. Don't fly in any manner that might scare a manned aircraft pilot, because not that they hate us, not a matter of that, it's just that they're very concerned about bumping into things, and if they see a drone anywhere around them, they're going to pick up, their interpretation of the event is going to be probably different than yours. They're going to report that, wow, that was pretty close. I better tell the FAA. Well, the FAA is going to call you up and say, what happened? And it's your word against his word. If you basically scared that pilot, more or less, they're going to listen to that. And what kind of trouble you in, I don't know. But the more that happens, the more the FAA will likely increase the regulations to make it more difficult to fly drones. Of course, right now, the FAA has no way to know who did that. They can't track you down, but with the remote ID, of course, they will be able to track us down and find out who we are, where we are, and why were we doing that. I'm not paranoid, but there is a healthy level of paranoia about things like this. But it seems pretty simple that we want to get along with the rest of the aviation community, and we don't want to be going around scaring pilots. We just need to avoid them, because it's a danger to us as well. Operation over human beings, it's paragraph 39. Remember this rule has been amended as well to make the possibility, if you meet certain categories, that you may do this, but that's, if the question is phrased, it'll include that, but most of the questions are going to be just like this, where no person may operate the unmanned aircraft over a human being unless that human being is directly participating in the operation of that UAV, your visual observers and all those folks, or the human being is located under a covered structure inside a stationary vehicle that can provide reasonable protection from a falling unmanned aircraft, or the operation meets the requirements of at least one of the operational categories specified. Right? That's what we're talking about with the propeller guards and being less than 0.55 pounds and having remote ID. That's those categories. Category 2 and 3 being what the manufacturer has to say has certified that aircraft before you get hold of it, or you can buy parts that might add remote ID perhaps, but we talked about that earlier, so just go back to the previous video, or the first video I believe, and that'll explain all that. We have extensively looked at this in an earlier video, but this is just a reminder. You can pause the video if you just want to read through this, if it'll be helpful. We'll continue on. Operation of certain airspace. This is just restating the class B, C, D, and E requiring permission from the controlling agency, also which you can obtain through the LANC system, of course, or a waiver for that matter. But just reiterate that that is a regulation that you must comply with. Operation in the vicinity of airports is 0.43, paragraph 43. No person may operate a small unmanned aircraft in a manner that interferes with operation and traffic pattern at any airport, heliport, or seaplane base. So this is what would apply at the Griffin Airport, right? There's no control towers, not controlled airspace, but you can't just buzz around the airport interfering with operations. It's illegal. Or a traffic pattern. That's why you have to know what the traffic pattern, what they are, what they're called, what they do. But there's other more obscure places like heliports, which would be possibly at the hospital, or it may just be in an office building, on the roof of an office building. You are not allowed to interfere with them either. Doesn't mean you can't go there. It just means you can't interfere with them. Does that make sense? So you got to be aware of the traffic in the area, which means you need to be keeping the traffic in sight. Not sure what that was. Probably because I've been talking for 30 minutes. Wow. All right. Operation prohibited restricted airspace as well. That's basically you're prohibited from flying in prohibited or restricted areas. Remember, restricted areas are often at the top of the chart. Or in the there's other sources online to find out when they're active and when they're inactive. So there may be, you can fly in a restricted area when it's inactive. Or you can get permission in a restricted area. But generally speaking, prohibited areas are just prohibited. Flight restrictions in proximity of certain areas. What we're talking to here is TFRs, temporary flight restriction areas, right? You're not allowed to fly in those. Pre-flight familiarization. This is a pretty lengthy section too, but it's basically saying that you assess the operating environment, consider the risk to persons and property in the immediate vicinity of both service and air. This is your responsibility as pilot in command. You must do these things before you fly. Ensure that all persons directly participating in the operation are informed about the conditions and what emergency procedures. What's plan B if things don't go out quite right? Everybody needs to know what their role is and what their responsibility is, and also what might happen, what hazards might be around that might affect the operation. Also, you as pilot command must ensure that all control links between the ground control and the small unmanned aircraft are working properly. That's why we climb up to a little below or above eye level and do your little maneuvers. Make sure the GPS is connected. That's your responsibility. If the unmanned aircraft is powered, ensure there's enough available power for the operation, for the intended operational time. If you're got a 10-minute flight and the battery is half charged, yeah, you probably do that okay. If you got a 30-minute flight and it's your responsibility to make sure you have enough battery power to complete the mission. E is ensure that any object attached or carried to the small unmanned aircraft is secure and does not adversely affect the flight characteristics or controllability of the aircraft. E, ensure that any object attached or carried by the small unmanned aircraft is secure and does not adversely affect the flight characteristics or controllability of the aircraft. All right, and the example here is you've got something attached, you're hanging a cargo load from a piece of string here, a cord or some kind of a connection here. As you fly the drone around, this thing will start to swing back and forth and changing the center of gravity of the drone, and eventually it just becomes uncontrollable because it's not securely attached to the drone. That's what they're talking about there. You're responsible for making sure it's securely attached to the drone so that the weight doesn't shift and create controllability issues with the drone. You know, a commercial cargo carrying drone is going to be engineered so it doesn't do that, but people do crazy things. Yeah, it just happens. F, if the operation will be conducted over human beings, under subpart D of this part, which is, remember those 4 categories again, ensure the aircraft meets the requirements. That's your responsibility. That's not the responsibility of anybody else. Not your boss, not the guy that owns the drone. You're the pilot in command. All right, operation limitations. This is just really basic stuff that we've talked about for a long time. And I'll just read them off to you. 80 knots maximum speed. 87 knots maximum speed. 100 mile an hour maximum. You just need to know the 100 miles an hour. 400 feet except in near proximity to a structure within 400 feet around the tower or structure. Structure is a better word to use because it could be a building. It could be a lot of things. It's got to be a structure though. I guess it could be a mountain too, because it would be 400 feet over the top of the mountain. Okay, sure. Anyway, visibility no less than 3 statute miles. You must have 3 statute miles. And distance from clouds 500 feet below the cloud and 2,000 feet around the outer edges of the cloud. Can't get any closer than that. And if you use a little bit of common sense and logic, you can see why that would be a bad idea to be closer to clouds, simply because there are manned aircraft out there that could pop out of the cloud. Okay, that is all I have. Again, I urge you to check out the Remote Pilot Systems Study Guide from the FAA. Very handy. It gets updated from time to time. I see that the latest update is August 2016, so it's a little bit dated. But as we go through the next few lessons, we will talk about changes. So we've already done that. Lesson number 1, we talked about some recent changes to the FARs. That again reminds me to remind you that the FAR is going to be changing, and the responsibility as a PIC, once you get your license, is to continually be a learner and research these things. Don't take people's word for it. Your buddies are going to say, oh, well, the rule changed. Here's the new rule. No, you need to go to the website, the FAA website, go to the 14 CFR or Part 107, and do the research yourself. Good day.